systems to make a greater contribution to our individual and collective well-being. And that goes beyond what we think most of the time when we say parks and we think about, playgrounds and trails, and in Minneapolis, a lot of lakes and other things. Um, and how does that help? How to bringing people together? How do we think about racism and equity and societal challenges, and how do you get people to work together across all those in places that we hope to get to be common ground. Um, because just having a great park system does not mean that all those other things will fall into place. So we have a great park system in Minneapolis. Matter of fact, we're ranked consistently as the #1 park system in the United States. However, as we all know, Minneapolis is, dealing with incredible racial disparities, the murder of George Floyd, and it doesn't mean that because we have all these great public spaces and access to nature, that all of these other problems go away. Matter of fact, sometimes in our city, it's way easier to talk about our great parks than it is to talk about, the fact that, Minneapolis can be a really bad place for Black people to live in. And so what I would encourage you as you're thinking about your parks, and never giving up on, yes, we need to make sure that we have resources, they're adequately staffed, that we have great spaces. But then next, what do you do after that? Right? So when you start to think about programming, what kind of programming can you do that starts to bring together people, where you can start to talk about other concerns in your community or other things you want to have happen. So as we continue to talk about the importance of public space, which during the pandemic has been something that everyone talks about, and that how important parks and public spaces are for people to get to and get into and access, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, during the pandemic, what we saw and what we know is that we have these disparities. And yes, having a great space is wonderful, but if you're worried about whether or not you're going to have housing next week, or you lost your job, or your schools aren't working, being able to enjoy that space or be a steward or an advocate for it is a lot harder. So we can't separate these things, from one another. So if we're thinking about neighborhood parks, or in Minneapolis, that's the heart of our system. If we're thinking about neighborhood parks, we have to think about them, in their totality. What's around them? Is there a school nearby? What kind of housing? What's going on the commercial corridor? All of those things are part of the total urbanism that goes on. And when we're talking about developing or new parks or whatever, how do we make sure we're bringing all of the folks, housing advocates and educators, workforce, social service, the faith community, environmental justice advocates, youth organizations, health professionals, artists, cultural organizations, neighborhood groups, business groups, finance, like all those folks, should be around the table as we continue to talk about this work. Sometimes, well, not sometimes, all the time, that's more work, to have an expansive table and to bring people around it. But the more diversity you have, the more innovative your solutions will be, and the more opportunity to make change. I think that's really important. So you might ask me, well, can you give me some examples of where this is going on? How does this happen? Where are people really using parks as platforms, not only for what we would think of them typically at, but it's more for social change and other things. So I'm going to give you a couple. Currently, one in Minneapolis is currently our park system is rethinking its recreation centers. And I think most of us think of recreation centers and we think of a lot of, usually kind of a bland building that is mostly around athletic opportunities, basketball and other programming. We're starting in our park superintendent, youth is really one of his focus. We're really starting to ask a question like, well, what else can recreation centers provide as a place where young people go? We actually have 57 recreation centers across the city of Minneapolis. But the question is not the number, but what else should we be doing there? What other things are important, and how can we use recreation centers to really make a difference in kids' lives? So we're starting to talk about how do we incorporate entrepreneurial opportunities. We're starting to talk about, beyond just homework help, but what if young people could come and learn coding? What if they could come and be connected with business folks? How do we move, maybe somebody 17, 18 years old who's got an idea for a business, give them support, get them going. We've talked about having barbershops in there, which the barber then would be teaching young people how to cut hair. So we're really trying to think about, well, what does it look like if we reimagine recreation? We're also going to pilot 4 what we call creation spaces. Each one of these will be a different type or series of creative activities and professions. So one is going to be around music and video and graphics, and one's going to be around design and urbanism and architecture, and one is going to be around culinary creativity. So we're starting to think about, well, what does that look like? Because we already have the buildings. So we already have infrastructure that's there, and they're open after school. And we're actually, a lot of our rec centers are open later into the evening, I think, 8 o'clock. So that, there's a long time frame there. So we already have all that. So we're starting to think about, well, how do we use them in a different way? The other one I'm going to give you is organization called Reimagining the Civic Commons. Reimagining the Civic Commons is a 10-city learning network organized and supported by 3 foundations, Knight Foundation, Kresge Foundation, and JPB. One of the cities is Detroit. The idea of reimagining the civic commons is, how do we use parks and public spaces as a way to create connections, build capacity, create jobs, build trust in communities, deal with inequities. And so it's really about transformation in the way these work, not always transformation in their physical. So yes, creating some new spaces may be part of it, but a lot of it is about, okay, well, we have these platforms already. One is, how do we raise their importance? So we think about them as deeper and more important than maybe people think about them now. And then 2 is, how do they operate differently to create opportunities? So, in Detroit, they're doing work in the Fitzgerald neighborhood, around a park there, and then how that extends to the commercial corridor there and housing. So, and in places like in Memphis, they're working on parks in underserved neighborhoods and then programming there. So you can go to Reimagining the Civic Commons and get to their website. Just type in Reimagining the Civic Commons and you'll see that. But I think it's one of the ways that people are starting to think about public space and infrastructure in deeper ways. I'm really thinking of it as transformational, across society. So that's, those are things that I really think are important. I think to get to that point, and you talked about it earlier, is, this is really about co-creation as far as the community and these other enterprises and go. So, if the community is not, at the table, in a partnership position and with power, you won't get what the community needs. And so that's a really important part. So civic engagement and social economic mix, how do we keep all these people together and driving towards, some goals that we've agreed on is really important. And what I always say is that, nobody knows what you need in your community better than you do. and that is so important. We in in Minneapolis and where I work, we raise a lot of money, and that is true. But a lot of times, and the fundraiser, the chief development officer hates when I say this to her, but I'm like, that's easier than having these hard conversations about how do we make these spaces do more than just saying we have a nice park, because we have a lot of nice parks, and we've been able to enhance them, with things that maybe the park board couldn't do, but at the same time, our real challenge right now is to think about here, how can those great spaces really start to solve a lot of these deep-seated social and racial issues that we have in Minneapolis. Because when people come to the park, all of the other attendant concerns and whatever is going on comes with them, right? Because that's just the reality. So place is connected to all of the social, economic, everything that's going on. So we can't say, oh, well, it doesn't matter. We have to think about that. So, part of all of that work on the fundraising side is thinking about the holistic strategies and also thinking about money for programming, which is so important. And a lot of times we leave that out. We'll fundraise for physical, but we don't talk about programming. And then it's like, how do we make that work? Or we've got a grant for 1 year of programming and we don't know what's going to happen. And so programming is critical in terms of impact, right? Because that's really where you get your connection to people who come use the park. And the more we can think radically about programming and about partnerships, not thinking you have to do it all, but okay, can the library do something? Can the schools do something? Can your partners do something? You've got partners who you're working with who are doing, you have pictures of them doing cleanup and mulch and this and that. Well, what other things can those partners do as we think about, important programming, and what does that need to be to be successful and to contribute to the greater well-being of your community? So what I would close and say is that, I believe that, that parks and public spaces are a great opportunity to create the kind of world that we would want to live in. That they've been, though, kind of treated as, the icing on the cake, in a lot of ways in communities, and it's great to have them. But if our budget starts to get bad, it's the first thing that goes. But I think as we integrate them more and more into the fabric and into the total fabric, it gets harder and harder to do that, to cut them out, because they're become so important and so much a part of what makes your community great. And with that, I will stop, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Ron. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask? Okay, well, I guess I'll start out. First of all, you said some amazing things, but obviously you said some things that really don't really upset me, but I know you're right in talking about that we have to be able to connect parks with what's really going on in the community, and to kind of integrate that. I don't think I quite know how to do that, because our physical spaces, Paul, have just been so challenging that we just feel like our citizens, our children deserve better, and we need to be able to get the basics done. The basics are, we need to be able to have parks that are clean, that are safe, that are maintained. And then, well, maybe we shouldn't wait till the then. Maybe we have to do it simultaneously. But, in my mind, it's like, and then we can look at the other stuff that needs to happen, and programming and all of the other things that you talked about are really good. But, I'm struggling with that because our parks do not mirror the parks in our surrounding areas. And that bothers me because I know that there is no reason for that to be so pronounced in our community, except that we are not making the priorities. We are not aligning ourselves and working together to make that change. So, and I see that coming together. I see that changing. People want to see a change. They want to see the parks spaces where people can come together. It's just, how do you make that happen?
All right.
So where do you start? I mean, to begin with, where do you really seriously start? I mean, because you're talking about bringing a lot of people to the table, but who's the most important person that needs to come to that table?
Okay, so one I would say is, the work is on a continuum, and you can't, and you're absolutely right. You cannot say to people, well, we're going to make all these connections, but when we go to the park, it's awful. So if one of your big challenges is we have to have better parks, and we have to have equity in terms of, money that goes to parks and what our parks are versus other parts of the community parks. Yes. And that's one of the things, and the physical part is one of the things that you can get people to the table around. And so what I would say is you focus on that and you get these players to the table, but then you talk about the fact that, well, we need to fix these. We need to do this. We need to do that, whatever it is. But at the same time, this programming, these are important too, and we have to talk about those also. So, like I said, your community best. So, who are key players you need to get to the table that go, yep, you're right. We have to do the parks, and then you can expand that table. You don't have to bring everybody at once. But I would say the most important people from my vantage point is to make sure that community is represented at that table so that what's going on is not being done to them. So I think that's, from my vantage point, that's really important, that community is clearly represented. And every community situation is different. So if a clear need is to improve the parks physically, et cetera, then you need to do that. Yes, absolutely. And I wouldn't say, hey, let's talk about programming when our physical facilities are not working. But I think, you can work on both of them. It's hard, but think about it this way. If you're doing a school, you want to talk about the physical space, but you also want to talk about, well, what do you do inside of it and how do you deliver education well, too. So, yeah, you start where what's most important and what's most needed in your community, and you build on that.
Okay. I think that's good. It's given me a thought that we don't necessarily focus on programming, but we have many organizations, some of them are online tonight, who do a lot of programming. I know that the PAL organization, the Pontiac Police Athletic League, do a lot programming in the parks. And I think what I hear you saying is that it would be to our advantage to partner with groups that are doing things in parks. I think the Ascend Foundation has events and things that they are doing things in parks. And there are others. So we need to partner. In other words, these are the folks that we need to bring to the table in addition to the city, so that as we talk about how we can change the physical amenities of the parks and make them more accessible, make them spaces that people will want to come to, that we are working in tandem with community groups that want to have activities in the parks.
Right.
So,
and you don't, right, and
okay,
you don't
I
have
think
to
that's a
do the
good point,
programming
and we
yourself.
will do that. We will, you know,
Yeah.
we will start working that. That's a good strategy.
And those groups.
Do we have any other questions for Paul? Yes, Ron. Can you unmute yourself?
Thank you.
What?
Yes. I associate with Rotary Park. It's the nearest park to my house. And I've been over there many times, and I've actually put nets up on the basketball hoops because there weren't any there. And I'm glad to see now they're being replaced, kept up. But I would like to ask everyone here today that's present, do you have a park that you associate with where you live in Pontiac?
Any comments on that?
Kathy Lee, what park do you associate with?